Hi, I'm Parmesh from the Godrej India Culture Lab.
I'm Nisha.
I'm Gaurav.
And we are from the Ladies Finger.
On the Independence Weekend of 2015, we had an incredible film festival called
The Wandering Women Feminist Film Festival.
And the video that you're about to see is of one of the panel discussions of the festival. We hope you like this video, and please visit both our websites, ladiesfinger.com and indiaculturelab.org, for a lot of cool stuff. Thank you.
My name is Nisha Susan. I'm a writer and journalist. I'm one of the founder editors of the Ladies Finger. Earlier, I used to work with Telka magazine, and I also was one of the two editors who ran a long-form destination on Yahoo called Originals. Okay, that's me. Now, we're here to talk about more exciting things. We're here to talk about how has feminism impacted the documentary form in India. That's what we're going to talk about today. Before that, I'm going to introduce everyone. Bishakha, many of you have already met, but I'm going to go through it again. Bishakha works on gender and sexuality in the digital age. She runs the non-profit Point of View in Mumbai. She writes and makes films. She's perennially interested in what's not freely expressed. She's edited 2 anthologies around women's lives in India, one of whom has a great name, and Who Will Make the Chapatis, my favorite anthology name. Films she's made include In the Flesh, Taza Khabar, which we watched, Zinda Lash, and Out of the Closet, which is her latest film from 2009. She's currently working on #Selling Sex, a non-fiction book on the lives and realities of sex workers in India, and is half of the duo behind the online, very, very cool imprint, Deep Dives. Okay, that's Bishakha, everyone. Okay. Also with us today is Navaneetha Mokkil. Navaneetha is an assistant professor in the Center for Women's Studies, JNU, New Delhi. She's our import. Her research and teaching are in the areas of gender studies, sexuality, politics, and literary and visual cultures in India. Her articles on the non-linear imagination of sexuality have been published in lots of journals, in anthologies. She is also the co-editor of the forthcoming book, Thinking Women, a Feminist Reader. That's Navaneetha. Deepanjana Pal. Deepanjana Pal is a Mumbai-based author and journalist. She's a senior editor with firstpost.com. If you guys don't follow her on First Post, you're really missing out. She's written about Indian contemporary art for a variety of print and online publications, including Wallpaper, Caravan, Business Standard, Tehelka, Arts Slant. She edited Time Out Mumbai's art section. She was the books editor for newspaper DNA. And she's written a book on Raja Ravi Verma called The Painter. Apart from all this, every 5 minutes that Deepanjana gets bored, she starts a blog. Okay. In fact, right now, while I'm like introducing her, she's thinking about her next blog. This is Deepanjana. Okay, so that's our team. So to get back to the topic, how has feminism impacted the documentary form? So I was like thinking about the stuff that we watched today in terms of simple representation. We have just 10 films, and this 10 films in this festival is a very small, slim slice of the great amounts of work that feminist documentary filmmakers have done in this country. And just looking at what we watched just today, the kind of women we see represented today, we see an 88-year-old amazing actor, we see an activist, we see a truck driver, a community organizer, we see a reporter, we see women sleeping in public, getting like some 50 shades of chumpy type chumpy, okay, and getting shaved, all kinds of exciting things. And this is from like one day of like a small documentary film festival. And mostly we get excited about mainstream media giving us this. A girl from West Delhi breaks up with her fiancé and then goes to Paris on holiday. Okay, this is like the most exciting thing that mainstream cinema has given us for a long time. And this is a representation that we're supposed to be grateful for. So I want to ask, can we like change, like look away and look at where all the action really is? Okay, so do you want to start? Okay, so actually it's a good plan for Deepanjana to start, apart from the fact that I like torturing her. But when we talked before this panel, one of the things that she said is that the streak of anger or anxiety and rage that runs through feminism today partly is about the lack of representation. The kind of women and kind of lives we want to see just doesn't exist in the mainstream, and that really makes us anxious, frustrated, angry, all of those things. Isn't that true?
I think this is really mean to put me on the spot first, but because I'm Bengali, I can deal with it. Um, no, I think like you just said, that, that we're excited about a woman who is not devastated to the point where she slits her wrist because she's, ditched at the altar. That being the most exciting thing that we've had in years, says a lot about where mainstream cinema has kind of failed the representations of women. I mean, if we just look at something like, the reporter called Kavita in your film, she's so excited to go out there and do the work. And, that scene in which she's in a crowd and she's tapping different men on their shoulders to move them aside, that is confidence. That's something that very few people will notice unless they're women, that how much confidence it takes to just tap on a stranger's shoulder and say, boss, side. We don't see any of that. What we get to see in mainstream entertainment are seriously glossy, artificial, homogenized images. I mean, it's not even, I'm not saying that you have to have realistic looking women or real stories. I mean, I'm realistic slightly. But just think about it, like even 20 years ago, the range of looks that you had amongst our heroines was so much varied than what we have today. Today you have the same body type, the same styling, almost the same kind of wardrobe showing up everywhere. You're sort of homogenizing the entire experience of being a woman, which is completely at odds with the reality, which is that right now on this panel, not one of us looks the same, and we share the same, politics in many ways. You have an amazing amount of variety today. We have the freedom as well as the access to material ideas to be able to be, as different as we want to be. And we just don't see those stories coming out. We don't see those stories because we don't have enough platforms like this one. I mean, they're obviously being told. There are people who are seeing them, they're writing about them, they're there. We just don't get round to accessing them. And the reason that's immensely important to do is that it reminds you of something that a gentleman kind of asked in a question some time back, that are all the women together? I mean, all the nothing are ever together, but if you don't know that there are these stories out there, how do you create those alliances? Not just between women, but just between people who think the same.
Navaneetha, did you want to say something? Okay. When Bishakha and I talked, I think you were saying that representation isn't enough. It isn't enough to just have a woman-centered film for it to be a feminist film. You said there is a kind of practice, a gaze, which makes something feminist. So I wondered whether you'd want to talk about that.
Okay, so I guess one of the things that I was thinking when I was invited on this panel is that when we say what has feminism brought to documentary film practice, in a sense, the first thing that we will think of is the range of subjects who we've seen in all the films today, right? And both of you have alluded to it, so I won't go into it. And that is, of course, extremely important to really, I mean, think about it. If in another day and age, right, none of these women would have been considered worth filming, let alone like who would have made a film about an 88-year-old woman, right, who was one of like the early film and theater pioneers. So I think it's very, very important that broadening the sort of net of subjects is one of the ways in which feminism has very directly contributed to documentaries all over the world. But I'm also thinking as a practitioner that maybe we need to think of a few other things. So for instance, one of the things that strikes me is what is the relationship between the filmmaker and the subject, right? If we think of the concept of subjectivity, is there any way in which the person who's being filmed, regardless of, age, race, caste, class, education, etc., is there some way that that person can play a role in determining how they are filmed? Or can they at least play a role in determining how they don't want to be filmed, right? How do we sort of bring questions like dignity and consent into the picture, not in that formal sense in which you sign a form and say, I consent, but really in that meaningful sense where you say, like, how do I understand, first of all, what I'm agreeing to? I mean, it's funny in a way because, you know, technology now has given us like smaller and smaller toys to play with. And we can make more and more intimate films in documentary. But how do we also explain to people who are on the other side of this thing that really looks like a toy, and you can make a film on your mobile today, right? So where is the ethics of explaining to that person in a way that they can understand how this film is going to be used, you know, how it might change their lives, not assuming that everything will be negative. So I feel like some of these things are also very much part of the sort of legacy that feminism has brought to documentary film practice.
I wonder whether you'd give us a few examples of how this works. I mean, from, say, the last few years or any time in the Indian documentary scene.
So maybe, you know, there are other filmmakers in the room, and I'm wondering whether you all can also contribute from your practice. But I can say a little from some of the stuff that I've done, for instance, right? Because we don't know that much about other people's film practices, to be honest. So one of the things that I did when I made In the Flesh is, because there were 3 sex workers, one of the questions that I was very worried about is, would they be comfortable sort of talking about their lives very openly and showing themselves very openly, right? And initially I had all sorts of notions in my head about like, oh, maybe I should pixelate their faces, and maybe I should like make them wear dark glasses, which sort of would have been a very weird Blues Brothers type of film about sex workers. But then the thing is, you know, then I did sort of the most basic and obvious thing, which is that I asked the women, what is it that, like, do you have anything that you want sort of, and all 3 of them said, we don't want this film to be shown on television. They didn't give a damn about pixelating glasses, etc., right? So I think the important thing is that, again, to understand that these women, regardless of the fact that they are sex workers or whatever, are A, capable of consent, B, of setting the terms and limits within which they'll be filmed, and then respecting it, right? So, of course, I put that down on paper, etc. It meant that I couldn't show the film on Indian television, but to me, that is like one of the ways in which you practice feminism, right? You bring it to the relationship between the filmmaker and the subject. That's one sort of example I can directly think of.
Hello, yeah, okay. Navaneetha, you have a lot of interest in how feminism impacts documentary filmmaking practice, right? Yeah, and you've written about it and talked about it. So could you go into it a little bit?
Okay, yeah. I mean, actually, when I heard the title of this panel, I was thinking that coming from where I come from, more as, less as a practitioner and more as someone who teaches film and analyzes film, like coming from an academic setting, you know, but also a person who enjoys watching films, right? So for me, the question is also in some ways reverse, like, you know, like you're saying, feminism has obviously given a lot to defining the field of documentary cinema, but it's interesting to think about what has documentary cinema done for feminism, right? Like in the sense of what ways in which, first of all, does the cinematic medium allow us to engage with the whole question of feminism? Not as something given, like not as something that, you know, like Stay Free tells us or Fair and Lovely tells us. Like the market today has, you know, is offering us certain models of what feminism looks like. But if we think of practices of filmmaking that we have encountered in the Indian documentary cinema context, just taking today's example, you know, from non-linearity to, you know, inconclusive moments, right? Like moments when sometimes even the filmmaker is surprised, like, you know, like I was thinking of the Morning film, like, you know, when in the Gulabi gang, one of the women is, says that, you know, if my brother is violent, like, you know, I might stand with him. Like, what do we do with that moment, right? Which is both a it's a troubling moment, right? Like, and I think a moment that makes you reflect, a moment that makes you pause. And some ways, documentary cinematic practices with its emphasis on intersubjectivity, on, like you're saying, engaging with these kind of women who are connected to each other, but also different, like, both the differences between the interviewer and the subjects, but also between the subjects. Not everyone you encounter, even when they are trying to build a collective, like, a gang, which is an interesting term to call a collective, then there is so much differences that emerge there, right? And what does that mean to show us those differences? Or even like, when you started off with your discomfort with popular cinema, I was thinking of the morning videos we saw where, like, like your films, like Paramita Vora's films, and your fascination with popular cinema, right? Like, so how do we draw on it as filmmakers? How do we subvert it, like bring it alive? And, sometimes even use humor, parody, forms like that to think about feminism in new ways, right? Like, so.
Dipanjana, I wanted to ask you, I mean, it's one thing for you to like be here in a sort of shared space to talk about your discomfort with mainstream cinema, but you also follow documentary very, very carefully. Have there been any big moments for you as a feminist, as a critic, when you were watching an Indian documentary film and you said, here is something that is so meaningful that, it's going to stay with me for a very, very long time?
I think, so it's quite interesting because I don't think it would be necessarily something that's considered a feminist documentary. It's from the grand old days of Doordarshan, when the idea of having an interesting frame was to have a potted plant in the corner. And that was like cool, and it was an expensive set. And there was one of these interviews in which it was basically a classical music series, and there were it was supposed to be a little sort of a primer on the history of Indian classical music through recording, and there was a record played in which the old phonographs, they ended with "My name is Gohar Jan" or "My name is so and so," and it was being played, and there were a bunch of younger, at that time younger people like Kishori Amonkar and everything. You had to see their faces when they were hearing those phonographs. It was a deadly simple frame. It was just three of them sitting there, and I particularly remember Kishori Amonkar's expression. There was a smile on her face. It was like, yeah, it's that sense of collective, which is not necessarily, I mean, it's working at so many levels, right? It is, of course, an artistic association that she's making, but it's also of two women who have made a profession out of something that was not considered respectably professional. It's a question of looking at technology and how that technology has allowed them to establish and assert a sense of identity. It's also about performance, because these are disciplines which are all about performance. This is not actually opening your heart out in any way at all. It's pure performance. But that sense of kinship was something that stayed with me, and for me, that's the power of non-fiction in general, but particularly non-fiction visual narratives, that they allow for a sense of identification at a far more immediate and quick level than a word like intersubjectivity allows us to appreciate. We read that word, we know that it's the right word. That's like reflexive, one of my most hated words, because it's so correct and such a mouthful. Like, anything that's reflexive should never have the word reflexive associated with it, Because you see the image, you hear that person, you see them move across that frame, and you connect. That, I mean, also, I mean, when I talk about feminism, and this is something that I'm sure everybody else in the panel can, talk about better than I can, it's also a definition of an ism which has changed very, very solidly over the decades. what we're talking about as, you know, feminism today is a sense of equality, it's a sense of redressing balances, but there is also another definition of feminism to which many espouse, which is far more radical and far more leftist, for the want of a better phrase. What do you associate that ism to? Will have a lot to do with the images that you associate with it. And in our visual culture, the visual narrative goes a long way in defining that.
I sort of wish that I was able to see that image right now. It's just that it's a little bit that. I wanted to ask you, Bishakha, that you've been, I mean, obviously you've had your great feminist moments of seeing something, but you've been also the moment in one sense. You've been part of the creation of great feminist moments in documentary filmmaking. Do you want to go a little bit into that sense of, did you actually have that eureka sex moment where you felt like, I am creating a new form, which is feminist, which is a departure from the bearded men, you know? So.
Okay, so let me now take off my, to answer this honestly, I will have to take off my good feminist hat and put on my bad feminist hat, okay? Yeah. No, so I think here's the thing, Nisha, and I think this is why it's complicated, and I'm glad you asked me this. I think in many ways, feminism can be something that's very liberating for you, right, as a filmmaker. And I think in many ways it can also be something that's very constraining, right? Sort of the political correctness part of it. And I want to talk about it because I think these are things that we experience. So quite honestly, when I made In the Flesh, my first reaction was like, oh my God, of complete panic, right? Because that was, again, that was in the early 2000s, right? Around 2001, 2. The discussions around sex work and feminism at that point in India was like, essentially, it was like a battleground, right? Yeah. With these two groups of women essentially not talking to each other, not acknowledging each other's experiences. So quite honestly, when I made a film which looked at sex work through the eyes of 3 people within it, my first concern was like, oh my God, am I anti-feminist? Right? And then it takes a lot of, at that point, you sort of say, well, okay, that's sort of the theoretical feminism part of it. But actually, feminism is much more than that. And then you sort of say, no, this is very much in line with, like, not in that party line sense, but sort of very much about the values and principles of feminism. But I did, quite honestly, at that stage, feel a certain sort of dissonance. I didn't feel I was creating the great feminist moment. I felt I was creating the great anti-feminist moment. Right? So that's one. And actually related to that, again, a question that I wanted to throw out is that, you know, sometimes I feel like also in terms of content, I think feminism has given us a lot. I wonder whether if we look at it in terms of complexity, whether we would make the same claim. And I'll give you an example. One of the things I've always wondered is how interesting it would be to go into, say, like a relationship, right? A heterosexual relationship, let's say. A man and a woman, a boy and a girl, etc. And sort of really dig into it through a filmmaker's lens. So you record everything, etc., etc. Then what happens? What happens if in the process you end up sort of feeling that this relationship, you know, that this woman is essentially like awful in this relationship, right? And the man is much more, I'm just sort of blackening and making it black and white to make it difficult. So what does that mean then in terms of feminism, documentary, censorship, free thinking, and all these kinds of things, right? So just to sort of think about what we've inherited by way of the complexity legacy from feminism. And I think the second question is actually around predictability. Sometimes when we think of feminism and film practice, I have to say, part of me feels like, oh my God, this is going to be yet another predictable film in which like the woman will be glorified, etc., 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 right? And that's the other half of the complexity thing. So I think it'd be interesting for us to, anybody has any thoughts around this.
Navaneetha, with the long view.
Okay.
So, I mean, to sort of recap, you're saying, I hope I'm getting it right, that feminism gives its own sets of sort of cliches and genre problems to work with, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that one would have to agree with, like, like you're saying with any kind of ism, like, there's a certain question of, how you define it, and then what kind of questions comes into your framing of whatever subject you take on, right? And I guess it's a question not just for a aesthetic practice, but any kind of, like, say, even academic writing, or just the practice of living itself. Like, if you define yourself as a feminist, there are questions of, what does then that mean, right? Like, what is the practice of feminism? And that comes in, I think, and sometimes it could be, like, it again depends on how we imagine feminism, right? That's why I thought the term wandering, like, which you define the, the hashtag and the title, is an interesting one, because in some ways the idea of wandering cuts against the idea of having a set idea of feminism, right? Like, because, most times, I think there's also a way in which not just people from outside, but even people who think of themselves as feminists also feel there's a set idea, right? And the question is, like, how do we, work with that idea, but also in some ways have the space to, navigate that idea, right? Like, wander within it, right? And somebody like Manju Ben, for example, is interesting, because I don't think, she would call herself by any term in that sense. Forget feminist, even man. So how do you then, how does one approach a person like that? Like, I think that film, I find very interesting in that way, as because in some ways there's lots of moments in the film which is just left open. Just these shots of the roads and her driving, or, I mean, there's so much of ways in which you're not trying to hold her within a frame, but to just let her be, right? Like, and that's difficult to pull off in a film. Like, I mean, another filmmaker who I really like, who's not Indian, but like Agnes Varda, I think sometimes manages to do that, because she's often playing with the idea of what it means to be a woman filmmaker, what it means to be a feminist filmmaker, what it means to be avant-garde. Like, so many of these labels which are there and which she takes on, but then she constantly disrupts, right? Like, and that, I think, is the potential of a concept like wandering, like, if you bring that into a conversation with feminism, right? Because, to make feminism more something which is more immediate, which you can work with, which you can redefine if you want, not in a free floating way, but that it's something lived in that sense, and therefore open to reinterpretation, I guess, right? That's why I think sometimes, like, where, rather than thinking of fiction and non-fiction as two binary categories, I tend to think of documentary as fiction too. I mean, documentary does have that element of, creating a narrative, playing with the imagination. You see some parts of their life, but, you have someone orchestrating it, right? Like, so, for me, the lines are pretty blurred, like, yeah. Okay.
Actually, this gives me a chance to air a private problem. Of course, because I want to air it in front of 450 people, or however numbers we have, no, much less now. Okay. So about a week, 10 days ago, I went to a series of performances which were called Gender Bender, and the ever versatile Afra Shafiq was there doing art there. But there were many, many interesting things there. It was a small audience and multiple performances, art installations. One of the performances, a short performance, was a monologue performed by a woman actor. She had set this story as, basically the plot is, she's talking to a friend who's come to visit her. She's telling the friend, I'm getting married in a few months, so there's a bunch of things I want to do quickly before, I move from this city to Indore with my in-laws. And as the story develops, you find out that what she wants to do is rape a man. Okay, and the thing is, it's sort of mind-boggling as the story develops, because the person that emerges in that performance is a serial female rapist. Okay, so while she's performing, of course, she's also talking to this imaginary friend who she's giving cold coffee to, generally being very sweet, to offering a head massage, and detailing out this gruesome series of rapes. And the thing is, what was happening there was that the audience kept laughing. Okay, and the audience kept saying he continuously, and a few of us were all looking at each other and saying, wait, male rape is not really funny, so is that what is the point of this performance? Or is the point of this performance that when you flip the idea of a sweet person who also rapes, then what do you do? But actually the audience was mostly going hee, okay, and there about 2-3 of us were just like wanting to laugh because actually the performance was really charming, but also like dying a little bit inside. So I just offer you this additional piece of discomfort, okay, okay, to add to your problems.
But I think what you're talking about is a very central problem that as just regular people accessing entertainment, you know, that we constantly come across, that there are very well-meaning ideas, potentially. I mean, I'm hoping that this is a well-meaning idea, but you know, there's an attempt to be progressive, which is actually just regressive, because if you're going to turn around and say violence on that gender is okay, but isn't for my gender, no, that's a little bit flawed logic. But it's like, I mean, sometimes to me, what's very interesting is also the absences and what these absences denote. And since we're sharing, you know, personal moments of trauma, let me join into this one. I recently had to watch a film that I hope none of you ever have to watch, called Brothers. Oh, clearly some have. Anyway, so it's a direct remake of an English film, and in the English film, one of the pivotal points of the story is that a family is divided. A woman who was abused by her alcoholic husband leaves him. She and her son leave him, and then things happen later on. What happens in the Hindi film is that not only does she stay with him, sorry for the spoiler here, but he kills her.
Oh, jolly.
We're still supposed to care about him though, because apparently leaving your husband is a much bigger crime than killing your wife. Right. That's how it's been interpreted by those doing the adaptation, who incidentally have adapted that story so that it is more acceptable to an Indian audience. Understand this, that leaving your alcoholic husband is a Western thing to do. Killing your submissive wife is an Indian Christian thing to do. You know, because that's the kind of people we're talking about. But it's not a bad thing. He goes to jail, he comes out of jail, he's not drinking anymore, so, and he's got bags under his eyes and white hair, so now we have to feel sorry for him, right? Amazing.
Nobody wants the mic. Nobody. They'll like, keep the mic.
I mean, that sounds totally like, I can't even imagine this film, frankly. But the thing is, what was interesting, Nisha, in the example you gave, as I was trying to think about it, and actually what came to my mind was, I think this would be interesting to talk about, even though it's not strictly documentary, because it's something, again, around feminism, legacy, portrayal, etc., is Gone Girl. Right, right? So the book which was originally written, I'm sorry, my memory for names has gone, but the film that was made by David Fincher, right? Yeah. And there were a number of comments on social media where one of the biggest critiques of Gone Girl seemed to be that it was anti-feminist or misogynist because it portrayed a woman in a negative role. Now, honestly, it's very hard for me to take that kind of criticism seriously, right? Like, if we start imagining that the feminist film legacy is essentially good women, that's a serious problem, right? Whether it's documentary or fiction. It has to be much, much broader. Yeah, it's totally like, then you're basically saying like, hey, Yeah, create cardboard characters, create good women, create boring films, don't be provocative, don't be human. My politics are good, my filmmaking is bad. I mean, this makes no sense to me. Right? Yeah.
I think I'm going to get that T-shirt for tomorrow.
So here's the, but then how do we, I think part of us, like as viewers also, unless we sort of respond to this kind of like fake feminism and filmmaking relationship by saying, no, we want like flesh and blood, rounded women, characters, who really represent the complexity that we demand of literature and cinema and everything in its the best senses of the word, right? As opposed to sort of this cardboard pastiche. I think that's something also we have to, as viewers, not fall into this like, yeah.
I think the anxiety with David Fincher's Gone Girl as opposed to Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl. Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl didn't have that kind of reaction, though some might argue that's because it's a book. So, less people read it.
It's a traumatizing book.
Huh?
It's a traumatizing book.
It is, yeah. But it didn't have the same reaction that the film did. But I think one of the reasons for that anxiety was that in some ways, that character was fulfilling every, what is that, men's rights activist anxiety. Like, she fakes a rape. She essentially keeps creating situations in which men seem to have victimized her, but, and actually she's the one victimizing them. In the book, it didn't quite come out like that. It was a lot more complex. And like you were saying, there's a complexity that makes for these arguments, makes it possible for these arguments to be taken forward. The moment you kind of flatten them out, a bit like what happened between the novel and the film, the debate becomes a little more confusing at that point. Because of course it's absurd, like you said, to say that if it's a feminist film, narrative, non-narrative, fiction, non-fiction, whatever, that it's got to be a good woman. I mean, really, I wouldn't be here if that was the criteria. But the point is that how are you contextualizing what is considered good, what is bad? And again, that kind of context, understanding that kind of context, I think has a lot to do with knowing the real stories. Right? And that's where I come back to documentaries, which is one of the reasons why I, as a random person who just likes watching films, enjoy documentaries as much as I do, because I feel like it provides me a context for the fiction that I watch, really.
Have there been films in the last few years which have been talked about as feminist films, which you've watched and written about, which have totally not worked for you because of this sort of goody two-shoes behavior?
I think there are, I mean, right now I'm blanking out, but yes, there are definitely films like that. One that comes to mind immediately is, after saying I've blanked out, is the one with Parineeti Chopra and who played a woman. No, not Hasi to Fasi. She was going, sorry? Yeah, that one, but that, see, there's
We're
a lot
like
of them.
hating on Parineeti right now.
No, there was one in which she was going around getting men and their families to pay for dowry and then... Thank you. That's really problematic to me. I'm supposed to care about this woman because she's basically good. She's just doing this one thing because someone has asked her for a dowry in the past. Like, this conception of good is problematic to me. This conception of good is very problematic to me because there is not in one of those cases do we actually know that these people would have in any way treated her like the commodity that she is asking them to treat her as. That is not a feminist heroine under any circumstances.
And was it being talked about as a cool feminist-ish
Yes,
film?
it was projected like that by the film itself, that this is an empowering story for women who are mistreated by those who want dowry, and the laws are against them, and therefore we are putting this thing out there to show that how badly they're treated. So, I mean, again, well-meaning, but completely confused in its ultimate execution.
In the reverse direction, actually, one of the earlier things you were talking about is, a documentary. Like for me, one of the documentaries that really was a feminist moment. I mean, one was actually Kamla Bai. The other one that really influenced me very strongly, and I think was made around that time and takes on the whole complexity issue, is Eyes of Stone by Nilita Vachani, where very, very briefly she takes the story. It's a 90-minute film. It's very sort of anthropological in some ways. She tells the story of a woman who lives in a village, is married, lives with her in-laws, and who occasionally goes through bouts of possession, right? Like being possessed by something. But what is really interesting is she follows it through, and then there's an amazing scene where she first makes you believe that yes, she is being possessed by something, but we can't really understand what this practice is, and she goes to this temple where people who are being possessed go, etc., right? Follows all that, and then there's a scene which is, in my opinion, just unbelievable in documentary, where the woman's husband comes home. He's a truck driver. It's very clear they have a difficult relationship, even though you don't see him, because that's what she says. And the minute he comes home and they start getting into some sort of argument, she again goes into the throes of possession, right? Except the way it is filmed, and again in a very empathetic way, she also suggests that maybe it's not so much possession as going into a state where you can say certain things to your husband or your family that you would otherwise not be allowed, right? So highly complex, not stopping at the sort of like surface level, but digging deeper to something which of course people could see as manipulation, right, etc., etc., but really digging into that. And to me, that is actually a fantastic example of really what feminism should be about.
It's amazing. Sounds wonderful.
No, just to add to it, it's interesting to think about, like, because David Fincher came up and, this whole question of whether like the two categories is just feminist and anti-feminist, like, because I don't think Gone Girl is a feminist film, but I don't think it's anti-feminist either. I don't think that's not the categories I would use to think about that film, because I don't think that's the burden the film is necessarily even trying to take on, right? And even a film like, say, while you were talking, I was also thinking films by male filmmakers, like, say, even I Am the Very Beautiful, like one of the films you've put on your list, in the Lady's Finger list you did. It's an interesting film in the sense that because it doesn't give you a comfortable position as a viewer, like,
Share a little bit about the film.
Okay, so it's this film which is done like, Bishakha was saying in the beginning, the whole question of intimacy comes up in a very interesting way, because the filmmaker is in, is in a relationship with this woman, like they share a sense of camaraderie and space, and this woman seems to have a complicated past, like she has worked as a singer, like sort of in bars, and and she seems, there's a certain way she projects herself, like, there are moments of violence on the body in the past, and a certain way she is very invested in her, sexuality and the way she looks, and so she talks about all those things, and there's the camera that's constantly recording her, right? And they're doing things together, they're going for treks, they are, she's changing her clothes, like, so there's a lot of, like, very intimate space sharing between the two of them. And she's telling her story, right? So, and there's the whole question of how do they relate to each other, right? And at no point, it's a difficult film to categorize her as a subject, because she's not in any way the simple, empowered, agential woman kind of narrative, right? She doesn't fit into those patterns at all. Yet she is, she talks about like her pleasure, for example, in men looking at her. So there are many things that, and then there's this male filmmaker who's constantly recording her, right? And so as a documentary film, it's interesting to think about, like, where would you understand feminism, and also who is behind the lens, right? Like, do we think about the identity of the filmmaker in categorizing the film, or is it more just a practice of filmmaking itself, right?
I wondered, should we take audience questions at this point? Yeah.
I was wondering how your work has influenced your definition of feminism. So if it's possible, can you even say how you define feminism now and how your work has informed or even changed that definition?
Okay, so sort of the shortcut thing that I use, and then I'll just add one word, is I always think of it as feminism is the radical notion that women are human, right? Yeah, that all women are human. But then if you take apart the word human, what that means is a whole set of things. And for me, quite honestly, above everything, is that we recognize that, you know, feminism means to make your own choices, and that we respect those choices even if they differ from yours, right? So my definition is very strongly influenced by much of the work that I've done in the last 15 years has been with women in sex work. And that's quite outside of filmmaking is one part of it. And to me, the reason we always have to say is it's about respecting women's choices is because this continues to be one of the most uncomfortable things in feminism, right? Where sex workers are constantly being accused of false choices and the choice that is not a choice and all sorts of terms that we would never use on other people. So that's pretty much my...
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Okay, yeah. No, I mean, I don't know, like, what exactly as a definition I would give you, but I guess it's something, you know, which has obviously shifted, like, you know, because I guess it also comes, for me, it's very located, connected to my growing up in Kerala, and, you know, a certain sense of, you could call it anger, you know, a certain sense of discomfort with certain structures, right? Like, it's changed with places, like, you know, my moving out from places I've grown up, but going up. So I think home definitely plays a space in not home in that very limited sense of, you know, my family, but in the sense of where you're located, right? And your location keeps shifting in, you know, I've taught in the US, I've taught in Gandhinagar, now I'm teaching in Delhi. And in all these locations, the classrooms change, but it's true that some of the questions, like, and for me, so teaching feminism is in some ways like teaching people to expand their thinking, you know, wherever they are located, whatever is housing them, how can they, how can they stay within that but still ask questions about that structure, right? I don't think there's a simple walking out, like, you know, but it's like it shouldn't be a standing still, right? Like, so how could we inhabit these spaces in ways that we constantly push against, right? And therefore the question changes with the context of the classroom, but it's always have a question. That's sort of how I think of feminism. Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to break Parmesh's rule and ask a long question.
Nahi, Paro, nahi.
Somebody's got to be the rebellious feminist cliche, no? So
with a question.
Yeah. So it's a comment and question mixed up. But I was just thinking, I mean, Kamlabai is one of those very landmark movies for the reason that when I interviewed Reena about making the film, and she said that when they first filmed it, and they made the first cut, and she showed it to the whole crew, and then everybody went out for coffee to discuss it, but they were quiet because they didn't know what to tell the director. And then finally, the youngest person, Suresh Rajamani, whom you see in the film, burst out, but she's not like that, how the film is, right? And Reena said that it's because we were trying to make a proper biopic, and then we realized we had to stop that and make what she was to us. So that is why also it's such a radical film. But in relationship to that film, and also the comment about the women in Khabar Lahariya and their confidence and what you said about it, to opine about the world. I'm also thinking about feminist filmmaking and why nobody ever talks about how it's also the spirit of the filmmaker to opine and to be artistic and to be seen as an artistic voice. So whenever everybody's talking about, I mean, I've never ever read a film review of a feminist documentary which is talking about the filmmaker's voice. And it seems to be more so for feminist films than for films made by men with or without beards, right? So in a sense, as women, you're continuously supposed to serve some kind of cause, whether of other women or of politics or whatever, but you're not actually supposed to just be an artist expressing yourself. And since now we have filmmakers and critics and academics, as the question I'm asking, it's a very loose question, but what do you feel about this? Tell us your real feelings.
Okay, so Parosh, I'll try one like top of my head level of answer. So I think this is again like it's the whole, you know, now if we bring another genre of filmmaking into the room, feminist porn, right? What do you feminist pornography, right? So what is it that goes through your head when you hear the words feminist and porn? The first word that goes through my head is certainly not aesthetics. It's certainly not artistic. It's political. And I think part of the problem is not just with feminist filmmaking, but if you were to add any other political label to an artistic venture, it immediately suggests a remove from the artistic, right? And it makes it sort of lesser in the artistic domain, which is why I guess many people say, I'm a woman and I'm a filmmaker, rather than I am a feminist filmmaker. So I don't have like a conclusive answer, but I think there's a problem in the labeling and in the combination of words that sort of immediately reduces the artistic value.
Bishakha, can I just intervene?
Why
And say,
not?
yeah, I mean, in the spirit of Paro, can we use feminist as an adjective instead of just as a noun? That's one. And if we did, what would it do? The second is, with your feminist porn thing, how would you place a base moi? Base moi, that French, it was billed as a feminist porn film that came out many years ago. It was a women crew, you know, women director. Anyway, it's an interesting. Okay, we'll go watch it. It's interesting because it used people from the porn industry as actors. It was very violent. Was shot by a completely by an all-woman crew, but was very, very violent in its depiction of, say, you know, even violence towards women. But it was it came out as an interest. It was billed as a feminist film. So, I mean, even if you haven't seen this film, to take your feminist porn argument a little further,
Let me respond to you with another term. Yeah. Okay, so there's a website called Hysterical Literature, right? Which is done by an artist, and what he does is he emphasizes the artistic aspect of erotica, porn, whatever you want to call it. It's actually very beautifully shot in black and white, and a woman comes to a table, sits down with her favorite book, and while she's reading a passage from a favorite book, and it's usually like not some grisly murder, it's usually like fairly literary in nature, right? Somebody is actually stimulating her below the table, and she has an orgasm. So now that yeah. But here's the interesting thing, because the emphasis, like the terminology is so much like hysterical literature, the filming of it is so like aesthetic. You know that that guy is an artist, right? You take away with you, you take away with you sort of an aesthetic, literary, sort of creative, I don't know how better to say this, Parmesh, yeah. This moment, right? Whereas and that's what I'm saying, I think terms, etc., have the capacity to influence the way you see things, although it's not an absolute, yeah.
Also, I think we need to be wary of assuming that just because a woman makes a film, it's a feminist film. That, I think, just by that immediate extension, it would mean that a man can't be a feminist, which, of course, is patently untrue. But what you were saying, Paro, I think it's absolutely right, that we sort of assume that a documentarian will have to follow a political agenda as opposed to acknowledging their artistic qualities as well. And I think some of this does come from our anxieties of having government-sponsored documentaries force-fed to us, almost. Some of them were great. It's not like they were bad films, as we all know, but they were government-funded. And the fact that they were state-funded, the fact that we've had, X decades of state-funded radio and television, all our non-fiction has come, well, some non-fiction at any rate. All our narrative and our commentary has, for a number of decades, been state-sponsored. So the notion of removing that and seeing the act of documenting from an artistic point of view is something that I think both as audiences as well as critics, it's something that we are growing into, I think.
I have a contention with that because it is about 25 years since these films were shown in cinemas, or that they are the primary kind of documentaries that people consume, right? So after a quarter of a century, there's actually no reason why we should be thinking
except in
like
that quarter of a century, I think the widespread watching of documentaries is gone. I mean, widespread, like the way it was on Doordarshan, you don't get to see documentaries in the same way. There are far fewer platforms. We do have exposure, and like I'm saying, I don't think we're not seeing that possibility of being both. But I think it's something that we're growing into. It's also because of what we see as documentary from elsewhere that our idea of what a documentarian is slightly changing, all for the better. But it's a slower process. I think it's something that we've inherited and we're trying to renegotiate, I think. I'm also saying this as a critic to make myself look slightly better.
Okay.
Can I? Okay.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be next.
Can I add?
Sorry.
Okay.
It's okay, after you. Yeah.
No, I think what you're saying, this whole question, it's a burden of the realism problem that documentary still seems to suffer from. When people think that somehow, and it becomes worse when it's, when you are quote unquote making it on a serious issue or a women's issue, or, that the fact that, yeah, that kind of, that it has, that somehow this is not a form, this is not representational, that it's, I don't know where it might be the burden of previous practice of viewing. I don't know, because if you think of it new cinemas in India was state-sponsored too, but nobody has a problem in thinking about Mridal Sen's films as aesthetic or artistic, right? So I don't think it's necessarily a state sponsoring, but it's a problem of that legacy that we somehow have this idea that documentary is simply recording, right? And that there's no question of form, or it's not telling a story, but it's not narrative, rather it doesn't have a language to itself, but that it's just showing you, and it's just, that cost kind of burden, right? Like that now you'll change. You've told us the life of sex workers, from tomorrow onwards their lives will be better, right? Like that kind of, and I think it's a burden that sometimes even feminist research has. You constantly ask, you've done research on women in Kerala, are they better off today? I mean, I don't think so, but is that, I mean, there's a difference between the aesthetics and, knowledge production and work on the ground, and they're connected, but I think all these different sides we'll have to engage with differently, right? And yeah, so I think that's where that's coming from.
Okay, so my name is Kim Singh. I'm a filmmaker and also a journalist. Now, the question I had was, see, I'm a person of color activist, AIDS activist, LGBT activist. Now, when you call someone a feminist, suddenly that moniker compels, at least from my perspective, that woman, or maybe a man, but mainly women, to to be really a hardcore bra-burning feminist. Nothing less is acceptable. I'm trying to see from a man's perspective that does that woman feel compelled that if I'm going to be labeling myself as a feminist, I really have to go all out, otherwise let me not call myself a feminist. So is this dilemma clear? Or?
I'll take one part, then you can take the other. Mine is probably already visible.
To burn them, give them to me instead. I have creative uses.
I think the fundamental part of calling oneself any kind of ist should be knowledge of the term. And feminism is, the term does not mean bra burning, neither does the history of it in recent times suggest as much. And if somebody has decided that they are a feminist because they would like to burn bras, then they are misinformed and therefore not a feminist. Stop being Marxist. Leave that side. Okay. The Marxists this assumption, the assumption that you're working from, or that you're speaking of, is the assumption that feminist means hating men. That is not the ism under any definition. If one hates men, one should not call themselves a feminist, they should call themselves a misandrist. That is the term for you. Now, in that situation, you will be bludgeoned, beaten by lots of people, but then, you know, at least you're being bludgeoned and beaten for what you stand for. If you are calling yourself a feminist and hating men, then you are doing everybody a disservice, so don't. Finally, if you believe in something, surely you are hardcore about it. I'm not sure what is this shame in believing in equality. Feminism, at a very fundamental, non-complex, not looking at nuances, not looking at history, at a very basic kernel, is saying that there should be gender equality in society. That's something I'm very happy to be hardcore about personally, but if one is not, then just don't call themselves a feminist. I don't think anybody calls themselves a feminist without knowing what it is that term means for them.
You'll be surprised. Okay, I'm coming to you, but I'm going to give it to Sharmishta first and then that. I'm coming. I mean, I didn't mean that.
Okay. Yeah.
So one question here, raise your hand for final question, and then we'll go straight to the back. Not straight, but we'll go to the back.
I've forgotten my question now, Pramish. No, mine is more of a general feminist observation, I would say, and just kind of thinking back at the, the documentary films we've watched today as well. But, there's this great skit by Amy Schumer, who can be kind of problematic as well, but, as we said, in which all these, it's talking about how women apologize too much. They keep saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And in this particular skit, I don't know if you've seen it, where, there's these very kind of established, luminaries who are women on this panel, and there's a moderator who's a man. And they just fall all over themselves apologizing. Even when the man has committed some kind of crime within that context, they're kind of falling all over themselves, just saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And I think that what makes films like, a film for me that was very iconic was Thelma and Louise, for example. Because, these women, first of all, are not taking anybody's permission for being bad. And bad in the sense that if you want to look at it as a binary good and bad, they're just, there's different shades within them. There's good, there's bad, there's everything in between. And, and at the end of it, which was kind of an extreme, but it just gives an example, is that, or a condition, is that they would rather go off that cliff than apologize for their behavior. You know what I mean? They're like, well, we can either turn back and say we're sorry and turn ourselves in and live this life of guilt and shame, or we can just die. That's kind of an extreme, but it kind of, if I look back at the female characters today in some of these documentaries that we've watched, what was so great is that none of them are apologetic, about who they are. They just are. And I think that is one of the strengths of, feminist, if you're going to be showing feminist subject matter, is that, is not good or bad, but there's many shades in between. These are colorful characters. And I think, again, another reason that a film like Gone Girl, similar to why Thelma and Louise was so uncomfortable in its time, is that this woman is pathological, but that is her character. And she should be able to play this character and fully flesh it out. And at the end of it, she gets a man and she gets everything. She's not the victim at the end of that. And she is not apologizing. She's like, well, she's pathological and she wins in the end. And I think that is what is so uncomfortable. So anyway, I told you it was a comment. There was no question. But you can feel free to respond.
So Baze Moa, the film I spoke about, is Thelma Louise. It's Thelma Louise on acid or whatever. It's like Thelma Louise various. So I mean, you should see both actually. You should see both.
So my question is about idea of a strong woman, because the mainstream cinema that we were talking about, and the way it has been portrayed in last 3 years, I find it very amusing, because their perception of strong women. And what is more surprising to me is the way people are accepting it. For instance, last year there was a film called Queen. So their idea of liberating a woman was that she goes to the club, takes off her clothes, and now she's a liberated woman. All right. And then there was a film called Mardani. She was a strong-headed woman. She was a cop, so she was abusing to every criminal, and she was using cuss words and profanity. So now that's their idea of strong woman. So I mean, I just believe that both their perception is also incorrect for the makers, plus the way, especially the young girls, the youth, the way they accept. So they, they confuse this whole terminology of feminism and, strong women. So that is.
Completely agree with you. Yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, that's what we were just saying. There's a certain amount of confusion about what denotes strength. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that Queen provided a story of a woman whose strength is not taking her clothes off in a bar. But that's not the film, right?
But that's also okay, no?
If she wants to take her clothes off, the point is she can. The point is also that if she doesn't want to, and that is not the only symbol put out. Context makes a huge amount of difference, because we have in the last couple of years had a lot of conversation on women, women's strength, feminism, all very good things, by the way, but it has also made us very, very hyper aware to certain things. For instance, Mardani, the fact that Rani Mukherjee's character has beaten that guy up or is cussing, there have been women police officers in Hindi cinema, in Tamil cinema, who have done precisely the same thing. It was not considered a feminist move at that point of time. These are characters. Particularly in popular cinema, these are characters. We are also seeing right now a really strong surge of on-screen violence, particularly against, what we consider beating the system from within. So you have male and female cops who are able to go mardhar and tod-fod through the system, give or take some gallons of blood and glycerin. These are now present-day concerns, which perhaps 5 years later, when we look back, we will be able to critically analyze and see where it's coming from. Right now, to assume from particularly our mainstream Hindi cinema that it is in any way a reflection of social attitudes, I think would be ambitious.
Hi. So I wanted to talk about the male voice, the lack of it or the presence of it. So I think in Bishakha, in your movie, in Taza Khabar, I felt as if, perhaps, I think her name was Meera, right? The one with 5 little girls. So her husband wasn't interviewed, say, for instance. I don't know if the other journalists were married or unmarried or whatever. But was that a conscious decision for you? I mean, you didn't want that male voice there. Because, of course, I mean, he would have to be supportive of her. And, I mean...
Okay, listen. So, one is, honestly, it didn't even occur to me. Out of the 3 women, one was separated, one, I think her husband had abandoned her. And Meera was married and living in the... But honestly, the question is, it's not even like it occurred to me whether it's a male voice or not. It just didn't seem relevant for the film, right? This is a film about journalists. For example, flip it. Imagine this is a film about 3 male journalists. If I went to one man's house to just like get a sense of how he lives, why would I interview his wife? Like, I can't quite see the connection, to be honest, right? So it's not so much about male voice and female voice or whatever. To me, it seemed completely irrelevant to the story. What is the male voice, firstly? Like, you mean to have a man speaking. But why is that important? No. I don't think feminist. No, but it's a good question because I think this is one of the misconceptions, right? Like, I don't think anybody is saying that feminist filmmaking in whatever genre has to be like an absence of men or only silent men or anything of that sort, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, this is honestly not a... I'm trying to think of a good example. Let me give you an example actually of a film which I really like, which challenges the whole concept of the male gaze. Okay, I think, but it's complicated. So there's a film called Blue is the Warmest Color, which won the big award at Cannes. 3 hours, love story between 2 women. So here again, how do we look at this film? I loved it, okay. There were very graphic sex scenes in the film. It was made by a man. The 2 women who were in the film said that he treated them really badly during the making of the film and that they felt like they were prostitutes, right? That was one of the terms that they use. So if we apply the feminist lens to something like this kind of film, what do we come up with? Right? If you look at it, if you didn't know any of this stuff about him and how the actresses felt, etc., to me, like, it doesn't matter whether a man made it or a woman. I thought it really captured the voices, sensibilities, right, of its main characters. That's what's important. So what I'm trying to say is that the male voice or the male gaze doesn't have to be, like, I'm not convinced that in every case there's a separate male gaze and a separate female gaze, right? Sometimes like sensibilities are mixed up. But also it doesn't have to be sort of always like this on-screen, obvious. I mean, I'm a little confused basically about, yeah.
And if you look at the Manju Ben documentary, I think that's a great example of how the male gaze, voice, everything is very much present. The idea of feminism is not to imagine a society excluding men. Many of us are straight, we'd like men. So, even if we're not, we still do.
I think it's incredible the conversations that we are having here and that actually we've been having through the data. So thank you, each of you who's asked a question, who's provoked, who's helped us. I mean, I've been wondering in jest, but I've seriously, this whole day has been an experience. I mean, I've been doing a lot of wondering about myself, about where I stand, about where I come from. So actually, it's been incredible. I want to thank all of you for being an amazing panel, for being here through the day and sharing this with us.